My name's Aaron.
I'm Enzo.
And I'm Josh. And in this podcast today, we're going to be talking about the progressive president, Teddy Roosevelt. The progressive era between 1886 and 1917 was a period of widespread social activism and political reform across the United States, focused on defeating corruption, monopoly, waste, and inefficiency. Progressivists sought to address the problems caused by rapid industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption, and by the enormous concentration of industrial ownership and monopolies. They were alarmed by the spread of slums, poverty, and the exploitation of labor. Multiple overlapping progressive movements fought perceived social, political, and economic ills by advocating democracy, scientific methods, professionalism, and efficiency, regulating businesses, protecting the natural environment, and improving working conditions in factories and living conditions for the urban poor. Spreading the message of reform through mass circulation of newspapers and magazines by, quote, probing the dark corners of American life were investigative journalists known as muckrakers. These were the main advocates of progressivism, who were often middle-class social reformers.
We're going to be talking about Teddy Roosevelt, also known as Theodore Roosevelt, who was born on October 27th in the Big Apple, also known as New York. He grew up being a sickly child and was fascinated with wilderness. He eventually graduated from Harvard and became a lawyer and an author. He had two wives. The first was Alice, who he married on his birthday in 1880. She died 4 years later, and 2 years after her death, he married his second wife, named Edith Kermit Caro, who he would live with for the rest of his life. He had 6 kids: Alice Lee, Theodore Kermit, Ethel Caro, Archibald Bullock, and Quentin. He ran for vice president with William McKinley, and when the president was assassinated, he became the president in 1901, becoming the youngest president ever. He was inaugurated on September 14th, won a second term, and his presidency ended on March 14th. Some things he did before his presidency was he was a National Guard for 3 years. He became the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and resigned during the Spanish-American War and started a cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders. He eventually died in 1919 on January 6th in Oyster Bay, New York, where he was buried.
Roosevelt was initially a member of the Republican Party candidate in the 1900s and 1904. Back then, the Republican Party was what we would consider liberal today, and he promised to hold back on some progressive reforms in exchange for free-hand foreign affairs. He also won the support of wealthy capitalists because they feared the Democratic victory in his third election. He founded and ran for the Bull Moose Party. This split Republicans and allowed Woodrow Wilson to win. He also campaigned against child labor. Major policies and reforms of Teddy Roosevelt were, in the domestic United States, his most major and influential policy was the Square Deal. The Square Deal promised protections for consumers, workers, and the environment. It consisted of the 3 C's: consumer protection, control of corporations, and conservation. He was the nation's first environmentalist president, expanding the National Park and National Forest Service. He put more than 200 million acres of land under public protection. And he even had a national park named after him. Some other domestic policies that he pushed through were major trust busting of, quote, bad trust. He differentiated bad trusts and good trusts by whether or not they benefited the people. Even more, he instated higher regulation on big businesses. During his tenure, the Supreme Court even ruled that the breaking up of monopolies was in fact legal. Additionally, he helped motivate the Panic of 1907. The panic was when the stock market dropped by 50% compared to the previous year. Finally, a major policy he pushed through was to establish many helpful tariffs. Tariffs, or taxes imposed on imported goods, were used to boost the domestic economy.
Teddy Roosevelt had many foreign affairs and policies that are still here today. One of his major ones was the Monroe Doctrine, which he added to, adding the Roosevelt Corollary, which stated that the U.S. would pay off debts of Caribbean and Central American countries. They did this with Venezuela and the Dominican Republic, increasing their influence around the world. He also helped establish many territories acquired from the Spanish-American War, like Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam. He also helped Panama become an independent country, helping split it from Colombia. And he bought the land making the Panama Canal, which was one of his most controversial acts. He also disputed Alaska with the UK after buying it from Russia, but eventually helped establish the Great Rapprochement, which was an alliance between Britain. He also created the Great White Fleet, which voyaged around the world, established better relationships with other countries, and helped boat technology. He finally met with Russia again to help negotiate the peace terms of the Russo-Japanese War.
Roosevelt had many long-term impacts. Like in 1904, Roosevelt made Taft the Secretary of War, and he became Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. Despite the personal ambition to become Chief Justice, Taft declined repeated offers of appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States, believing his political work to be more important. Some powers shifted from Congress to the president. He also made the U.S. meet the use of media as a means of shaping the public opinion border reach of political power on the world stage. Roosevelt also inspired the creation of the teddy bear because of the bear hunting he would often do. He's also one of the four presidents on Mount Rushmore, next to Jefferson, Lincoln, and Washington.
While Teddy Roosevelt was a very influential president, his presidency was not without controversy. These were namely the Panama Canal and his racist beliefs, especially when reflected upon today. The Panama Canal's realization was overseen by President Roosevelt. The canal, while incredibly beneficial, was marred with controversy during its construction. During construction, for example, Roosevelt sent United States warships to Panama City to support Panama's independence from Colombia. Another thing controversial, albeit not for the time, about Roosevelt's presidency was his racism. He viewed other races and nationalities as inferior to Americans, which is not good. Racism is very bad.
In all, Teddy Roosevelt was probably one of the most influential presidents of the progressive era and is one of the most influential of all time. He is still one of the most well-known presidents even 100 years later. His policies change the course of U.S. history, and every time you study him, his life gets more and more crazy. The era he lived in was one of the most influential in both politics and normal life.
The great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people to rule. I believe that the majority of the plain people of the United States will, day in and day out, make fewer mistakes in governing themselves than any smaller class or body of men, no matter what their training, will make in trying to govern them. I believe again that the American people are as a whole capable of self-control and of learning by their mistakes. Our opponents pay lip loyalty to this doctrine, but they show their real beliefs by the way in which they champion every device to make the nominal rule of the people a sham.